My name is Drew Means, and I'm going to be performing Sleeping Beauty by the Brothers Grimm. Once upon a time, there lived a king and queen who were very unhappy. They were unhappy because they had no children. But one day, at long last, their little daughter was born, and their sorrow was turned to joy. The king gave a christening feast so grand that the likes of it had never been known, and he invited all the fairies he could find in the kingdom, there were 7 of them, to come to the christening as godmothers. He hoped that each would give the princess a good gift. As the fairies were about to seat themselves at the table, an old fairy who had not been invited appeared in the hallway. She had left the kingdom 50 years before and had not been seen or heard of until that day. The king at once ordered that a plate be brought for her, but he could not furnish a gold one such as the others had. This made the fairy angry, and she sat muttering to herself. A wise young fairy heard the old fairy's angry threats, and she hid herself behind a curtain. She did this so that she might be the last to speak, for she feared that the old fairy might give the princess an unlucky gift. At the end of the feast, the youngest fairy stepped forward and said, "The princess shall be the most beautiful woman in the world." The second said, "She shall have a temper as sweet as an angel." The third said, "She shall have wonderful grace in all she says or does." The fourth said, "She shall sing like a nightingale." The fifth said, "She shall dance like a flower in the wind." The sixth said, "She shall play such music as was never heard on earth." Then the old fairy's turn came. Shaking her head spitefully, she said, "When the princess is 17 years old, she shall prick her finger on a spindle and die." At once the king and queen began to weep, but at that moment the young fairy came out from behind the curtain. "Do not grieve, O king and queen, your daughter shall not die. I cannot undo what my older sister has done. She shall indeed prick her finger on a spindle, but she shall not die. She shall fall into a deep sleep that will last 100 years. And immediately all the fairies vanished. The king, hoping to save his child from even this fate, ordered that all spindles in the land be burned. But this was all in vain. One day, when the princess was 17, she was wandering the castle. The queen and king had left her alone. She came upon a little old room at the top of a tower, where an old woman sat spinning. She was so old and deaf that she had not heard the king's command. "What are you doing, old woman?" said the princess. "I am spinning, my pretty child." "Oh," said the princess. "How do you do it? Let me see if I can do it too." She had just taken the spindle in her hand when, in some way, it pricked her hand. Immediately, she dropped to the floor. When the good fairy heard the news, she came quickly. She knew that the princess must sleep 100 years, and she knew that the princess would be afraid if she woke up and found herself alone. So she took out her magic wand, and she put everyone else in the castle to sleep, just as they were. The king and queen then departed from the castle and gave an order that no one was to go near it. However, this was not necessary. In just a little while, a wood, so thick that neither man nor beast could penetrate it, had surrounded the castle. One day, 100 years later, the son of the king who was reigning was out hunting, and he saw towers rising above a thick wood. He asked what they were, but no one could answer him, until, at last, an old peasant was found who said, "Your Highness, 50 years ago my father told me there is a castle in the woods where a princess sleeps, the most beautiful princess in the world. She can only be awakened by a king's son." At this, the prince, determined to find out for himself, set off for the wood. He leaped from his horse and began to force his way through the wood. To his surprise, the stiff branches gave way, but closed up after him, allowing none of his companions to follow. A beautiful palace rose before him. The prince entered the palace bravely. He came to a chamber of gold and saw a girl of about 17, looking as though she had just fallen asleep. He leapt to his knees, and he kissed her, and the enchantment was broken. The princess looked at him in wonder and said, "Is it you, my prince? I've waited so long." For they were so happy that they talked for hours and hours, and in the meantime, all of the people in the palace began to awake again. They had been doing what they were doing before they had fallen to sleep. The prince gave the princess his hand, and they all went to the great hall for a supper. And that very evening they were married, and they lived happily ever after. The end.